There is something they never told you, something buried so deep within the architecture of your daily existence that to even glimpse it would be to feel the ground shift beneath your feet. They never told you because they themselves have forgotten, because the forgetting is the price of admission into this particular theatre of shadows, because to remember would be to become useless to the machinery that requires your sleep. You were born into a world that was already narrating itself to you before you drew your first breath. The walls of the delivery room, the fluorescent hum, the masked faces speaking in medical incantations, all of it was already a story, already a frame, already a particular way of seeing that would become invisible to you, precisely because it was everywhere. This is the first and most profound magic trick ever performed, to construct a prison so total that the prisoners not only cannot see the bars, but cannot even conceive that bars might exist. Terence McKenna understood this. He understood it not as an intellectual proposition to be debated in seminar rooms, but as a lived reality that burned in his bones. Culture, he said, is not your friend. But even this radical statement barely scratches the surface of what he meant. Culture is not merely unfriendly, it is a predator dressed in the clothing of a nursemaid, a hypnotist masquerading as a teacher, a cage that has convinced its inhabitants that the bars are actually the entire universe. Consider what happens when you wake in the morning. Before your eyes have fully opened, before you have remembered who you are supposed to be, there is a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when you exist in a kind of raw, unmediated state. The dream you are having has not yet fully released you. The concerns that will shortly consume your attention have not yet coalesced. In that moment, you are closer to the truth than you will be for the rest of the day. And then the narrative reasserts itself. You remember your name, your obligations, your fears, your desires, all of them products of a particular cultural moment, a particular way of organizing human experience that is neither natural nor inevitable, but has been so thoroughly installed in your psyche that it feels like the only possible reality. This is what McKenna meant when he spoke of culture as an operating system. Just as your computer runs software that determines what is possible within its digital world, your mind runs cultural software that determines what is possible within your experiential world. The operating system is invisible precisely because everything you see is seen through it. You cannot examine the lens while looking through the lens. You cannot question the questioner. The culture becomes the ground of your being, the water in which you swim, the air you breathe without ever noticing that you are breathing at all. But here is the dangerous part, the part that makes certain people enemies of the state without ever committing a crime, the part that makes certain kinds of perception acts of sedition. The operating system can be crashed, the software can be interrupted, the dream can become lucid, and in that interruption, in that crash, in that moment of terrible clarity, you see not only that you have been asleep, but how you have been kept asleep, not only that you have been lied to, but why the lies were necessary, not only that reality is different from what you believed, but that the very concept of reality you have been operating with was a tool designed to prevent you from ever encountering the real. McKenna called this encounter with the real the felt presence of direct experience. It sounds almost mundane when stated in these terms. Of course, experience should be direct. Of course, presence should be felt. But the mundanity of the phrasing conceals its revolutionary implications. Direct experience, experience that is not mediated by cultural categories, linguistic structures, ideological frameworks, or the constant background hum of societal programming, is precisely what the culture cannot tolerate. The entire apparatus of modern civilization is designed to ensure that direct experience never occurs, that every perception arrives pre-interpreted, every sensation comes with an accompanying narrative, every moment of potential awakening is immediately captured and neutralized by the dream. Think about what actually happens when you look at a tree. The light from the sun strikes the leaves, is transformed by chlorophyll, bounces into your eyes, is converted to electrical signals, travels through your optic nerve, and arrives in your visual cortex, where it is processed, categorized, and presented to your conscious mind. But by the time you see the tree, you are not seeing the tree at all. You are seeing a concept called tree, a linguistic category that has been installed in your mind since childhood, a cultural object with a particular set of associations, uses, and meanings. The actual phenomenon, the light, the life, the presence of another being, has been replaced by a label, and the label is not reality. The label is culture. The label is the operating system running its program, converting the raw data of existence into manageable, controllable, useful information. Now multiply this process by every single perception you have ever had. Every sound, every touch, every taste, every thought, all of it filtered through linguistic and cultural categories before it ever reaches your conscious awareness. You have never, not once in your entire life, experienced unmediated reality. You have only experienced the cultural representation of reality, the map that has so completely replaced the territory that you have forgotten the territory exists. This is not a failure of human consciousness. This is not a bug. This is the feature. This is exactly what culture is designed to do, to stand between you and the raw, howling chaos of existence, to protect you from the terrifying freedom of direct encounter, to ensure that you remain a functioning member of the social organism rather than a mystic staring in mute wonder at the incomprehensible miracle of being. But protection and prison are not so different. The walls that keep the monsters out also keep you in. The narrative that shields you from chaos also blinds you to cosmos. The operating system that makes daily life manageable also makes transcendent experience impossible. And somewhere, deep in the structure of your psyche, something knows this. Something remembers what it was like before the installation, before the programming, before the dream began. This something stirs occasionally, in moments of great beauty or great terror, in the fragments of dreams that seem more real than waking life, in the strange feeling that this cannot possibly be all there is. McKenna devoted his life to listening to that something. He became a kind of archaeologist of consciousness, digging beneath the cultural sediment to find the older, stranger, wilder forms of human experience that the modern world has paved over. What he found was not comforting. What he found was that the culture we live in is not simply one option among many, not simply one way of organizing human life that happens to have predominated. What he found was that this particular culture is specifically designed to prevent you from waking up, that the suppression of consciousness is not an accident, but a policy, that your sleep is not natural, but induced. This is where McKenna's analysis becomes genuinely dangerous, genuinely threatening to the powers that organize our world. It is one thing to say that culture shapes perception. This is almost a truism, acceptable at any academic cocktail party. It is another thing entirely to say that this shaping is intentional, that there are forces, not necessarily conscious, not necessarily conspiratorial, but real nonetheless, that benefit from your unconsciousness, that require your sleep, that cannot tolerate your awakening. Consider the history of those substances and practices that reliably produce moments of genuine perception, moments when the cultural operating system crashes and the raw data of existence floods into awareness. Shamanic plants, used for tens of thousands of years by indigenous peoples around the world. Contemplative practices that quiet the narrative mind and allow something else to emerge. Ecstatic dance, rhythmic drumming, vision quests, all the technologies of the sacred that humans developed over millennia to pierce the veil of ordinary consciousness. What has modern culture done with these technologies? It has criminalized them, pathologized them, ridiculed them, forgotten them. The war on drugs is not, at its deepest level, a public health initiative. It is a war on consciousness, a campaign to ensure that the operating system remains uncrashed, that the dream remains undisturbed, that the prisoners remain unaware of their imprisonment. McKenna saw this with terrible clarity. He saw that the substances he had dedicated his life to understanding, psilocybin, DMT, ayahuasca, all the botanical ambassadors from deeper dimensions, were not merely chemicals that produced interesting effects. They were keys. They were technologies for crashing the cultural operating system and encountering, however briefly, however incompletely, the reality that the system was designed to conceal. And he saw that this was precisely why they were forbidden. Not because they were dangerous. Alcohol and tobacco kill more people in a day than psychedelics have killed in recorded history. Not because they produce social problems. The war on drugs has created more social devastation than drug use itself ever could. They were forbidden because they work. They were forbidden because they do exactly what they promise to do. They show you what's real. And what is real? This is where language begins to fail, where the operating system struggles to process experiences for which it has no categories, where the map encounters territory it was never designed to represent. McKenna spoke of it in many ways, used many metaphors, approached the ineffable from many angles. He spoke of a living, intelligent universe that is trying to communicate with us. He spoke of dimensions of being that exist alongside our own, populated by entities that seem to have their own agenda, their own purposes, their own interest in human consciousness. He spoke of a cosmic drama unfolding across billions of years, of which human history is merely a recent and peculiar episode. He spoke of language itself as a kind of technology, a way of creating reality rather than merely describing it, a magic spell that the culture has used to enchant us into a particular kind of sleep. But more than any specific content, more than any particular vision or entity or revelation, what McKenna pointed toward was the simple, devastating fact that there is more. More than this. More than the daily round of work and consumption and distraction. More than the anxieties and ambitions the culture has installed in you. More than the story you have been told about who you are and what the world is. The culture has given you a world that is flat, mechanical, meaningless, and dead. The reality it conceals is curved, alive, significant, and conscious. The distance between these two, between the world you have been shown and the world that actually exists, is the measure of how much has been stolen from you. This theft is the original crime, the primordial betrayal, the fall from grace that every mythology remembers in its own symbolic language. You were born with the birthright of direct perception, and it was taken from you before you could resist. You were born with the capacity for transcendence, and you were systematically trained to forget that such a capacity exists. You were born into a universe of unimaginable depth and beauty and terror and meaning, and you were handed a coloring book version with all the lines already drawn. And the most insidious part, the part that makes escape so difficult, is that you were taught to call this coloring book reality, to defend it as truth, to attack anyone who suggests that the lines might be arbitrary, that there might be colors beyond the ones you were given, that there might be ways of perceiving that the operating system cannot process. This is why noticing what's real is dangerous. Not dangerous to you, though in some ways it is, though the path through genuine perception is not comfortable, is not safe, does not lead to greater success within the cultural game. But dangerous to the system. Dangerous to the machinery that requires your sleep. Dangerous to the structures of power and profit that depend on human beings remaining in a state of confused, distracted, semi-conscious consumption. When you notice what's real, you become useless to them. You become unpredictable. You become unmanageable. You become, in the most profound sense, free. And freedom, real freedom, freedom from the operating system, and not just within it, is the one thing the culture cannot tolerate. It can tolerate dissent as long as the dissent operates within its categories. It can tolerate rebellion as long as the rebels still believe in the basic premises. It can even tolerate certain kinds of spirituality, certain sanitized and commodified versions of awakening that pose no threat to the underlying structure. What it cannot tolerate is the genuine article. What it cannot tolerate is a human being who has actually seen through the illusion, who has actually experienced the reality that the illusion conceals, who has actually remembered what the culture has labored so long to make them forget. McKenna was one of these human beings. He saw through, he remembered, and he spent the rest of his life trying to help others do the same, knowing full well that most would not listen, that the operating system would interpret his words through its own categories and neutralize their revolutionary potential, that the dream would absorb his message and use it as another decoration in the prison cell. But he kept speaking anyway. He kept pointing. He kept insisting that there was something to see, something beyond the horizon of the cultural world, something that would change everything if only we could bring ourselves to look. This is his legacy, and it is far more than a collection of ideas or theories or even experiences. His legacy is an invitation to notice, an invitation to question the unquestionable, an invitation to consider the possibility that everything you think you know about reality is a story told by forces that do not have your best interests at heart. An invitation to wake up. The question that remains is whether you will accept it, whether you have the courage to look where the culture has forbidden you to look, whether you are willing to crash the operating system and face whatever emerges from the wreckage. The culture will tell you not to. The culture will tell you that such investigations are foolish, dangerous, a waste of time, a sign of mental instability. The culture will offer you 1,000 distractions, 1,000 substitute satisfactions, 1,000 ways to go back to sleep. But somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the programming and the conditioning and the decades of carefully installed illusion, something in you knows, something in you has always known, and that something is waiting with infinite patience for you to finally pay attention to what is real. The question of how the concealment works is perhaps more important than the mere fact that it occurs. Anyone can feel that something is wrong, that the official story doesn't quite add up, that the life being offered to them is somehow less than what was promised. This feeling is nearly universal, though it is usually dismissed as personal inadequacy, as failure to properly adapt, as something to be medicated or distracted away. But the feeling persists because it corresponds to something actual. The cage is real, the concealment is real, and understanding its mechanism is the first step toward dissolving it. McKenna identified several layers of this concealment, several techniques by which the culture maintains its grip on human consciousness. The first and most fundamental is language itself. We are so embedded in language, so thoroughly constituted by it, that we rarely consider what a strange and powerful technology it actually is. Language does not simply describe reality, it creates reality. It carves the continuous flow of experience into discrete objects, assigns them names, places them in categories, and presents this categorized world back to us as if it were the world itself. But every language carves differently. Every language emphasizes certain features and ignores others. Every language embodies a particular philosophy, a particular way of understanding what exists and what matters. The language you speak is not a neutral tool. It is a lens that shapes everything you see. And the language of modern Western culture, with its emphasis on nouns over verbs, on objects over processes, on domination over participation, produces a particular kind of blindness. It produces a world of dead matter manipulated by living minds, rather than a world of living processes in which mind and matter are inextricably intertwined. It produces a world of separate things competing for resources, rather than a world of interconnected beings participating in a common dance. It produces, in short, the world that the culture needs you to see in order for the culture to continue operating as it does. McKenna was fascinated by the way different cultures had different relationships to language and reality. He studied the shamanic traditions of the Amazon, where language was understood to be magical in a quite literal sense, where the sounds a shaman made were not merely descriptions of healing, but actual agents of healing, where words were understood to have power in themselves, where the boundary between speech and spell had never been erected. He contrasted this with the Western relationship to language, where words are considered arbitrary labels attached to pre-existing things, where language is thought to merely represent rather than create, where the magical dimension of speech has been forgotten or suppressed. This suppression is not accidental. A culture that remembers the creative power of language is a culture that cannot be controlled through language. A culture that understands words as spells is a culture that is constantly vigilant about what spells are being cast upon it. A culture that knows the map is not the territory, is a culture that refuses to mistake the menu for the meal. The modern world has systematically trained us to forget all of this, to believe that language is transparent, neutral, merely descriptive. And in doing so, it has made us helpless before the constant barrage of linguistic manipulation that constitutes modern media, advertising, politics, and education. Consider advertising. Consider the billions of dollars spent each year to craft messages designed to alter your behavior, your desires, your very sense of who you are. This is not persuasion in any rational sense. This is spellcasting. This is the use of language and image to implant suggestions in the human psyche, to create needs that did not exist, to associate products with emotional states they cannot actually provide. And we accept this constant assault on our consciousness because we have been trained to believe that language is just language, that words cannot really affect us, that we are rational beings immune to such manipulation. This belief is itself one of the most powerful spells of all. But advertising is only the most obvious example. The same techniques, the same magical use of language to create rather than describe reality, operates at every level of culture. The news media does not report events. It creates events by selecting which happenings will be elevated to the status of news and which will be ignored. The education system does not transmit knowledge. It transmits a particular version of reality, a particular way of understanding what counts as knowledge, a particular set of questions and answer that foreclose all other possibilities. Science, for all its genuine achievements, has become a kind of priestly authority, determining what is real and what is not, what can be investigated and what must be dismissed, what counts as evidence and what is mere superstition. Each of these institutions uses language to construct the reality within which we live, and each of them benefits from our blindness to this construction. The second layer of concealment, closely related to the first, is the control of attention. Reality is infinite. At any given moment, there is more happening than could possibly be processed by any finite mind. This means that attention is always selective. We are always choosing, consciously or unconsciously, what to notice and what to ignore. And the culture has developed extraordinarily sophisticated techniques for controlling this selection, for directing human attention towards some aspects of experience and away from others. Television was, for McKenna, the paradigm example of attentional control. He called it the most dangerous drug ever invented, more addictive than heroin, more destructive than cocaine. This was not hyperbole. Consider what television actually does. It captures and holds human attention for hours at a time. It feeds the mind with pre-processed experiences that require no effort to consume. It replaces active engagement with the world, with passive reception of images and sounds. And it installs, through this constant exposure, a particular set of values, desires, fears, and expectations. The average American spends years of their life watching television. Years. The implications of this for human consciousness are difficult to overstate. But television was only the beginning. The smartphone, the social media feed, the constant stream of notifications and updates and alerts, these have taken attentional capture to a level that would have seemed like science fiction even a few decades ago. We now carry devices in our pockets that are explicitly designed to hijack our attention, to trigger dopamine responses, to keep us scrolling and clicking and consuming long past any genuine interest or benefit. The engineers who design these systems speak openly of the techniques they use: variable reward schedules, social validation loops, fear of missing out, all of them borrowed from the study of addiction, all of them aimed at ensuring that human attention remains perpetually directed toward the screen and away from the direct experience of life. This is not a side effect. This is not an unintended consequence of technological progress. This is the entire point. A human being who is constantly attending to their device is a human being who is not attending to anything else, not attending to the thoughts and feelings arising in their own consciousness, not attending to the needs and sufferings of the people around them, not attending to the subtle beauty and strangeness of the world, not attending, most importantly, to the dawning recognition that something is terribly wrong, that this cannot possibly be what life is for, that there must be more than this endless cycle of distraction and consumption. The great achievement of modern technology, from the perspective of the culture that controls it, is the externalization of attention. For most of human history, when there was nothing to do, people were left alone with their minds. They would sit and think, or daydream, or simply exist in a state of unoccupied awareness. These states are dangerous to the operating system. They are the cracks through which reality can leak in. They are the moments when the programming begins to glitch, when the narrative falters, when the direct experience of being alive threatens to overwhelm the culturally constructed self. The smartphone has eliminated these moments almost entirely. There is no longer any time when there is nothing to do. There is no longer any gap in the stimulation, any pause in the programming, any opportunity for the mind to settle into its natural state and discover what that state actually is. McKenna saw this coming, though he could not have predicted its exact form. He warned repeatedly about what he called the dominator culture's war on consciousness, its determination to fill every available moment with approved content, to ensure that human beings never have the opportunity to discover what lies beneath the cultural noise. He understood that the question was not whether we would have more technology, but whether we would have the wisdom to use it for liberation rather than enslavement. And he was not optimistic. He saw the direction things were heading, saw the ever-increasing sophistication of the techniques being used to capture and direct human attention, saw the ever-decreasing capacity of human beings to resist these techniques. He saw, in short, the possibility that the operating system would become total, that the concealment would become complete, that humanity would sleepwalk into a kind of permanent, technologically mediated trance from which awakening would become impossible. The third layer of concealment is the manipulation of time. Modern culture has a particular relationship to time, and this relationship is essential to its ability to prevent direct perception. We are trained from earliest childhood to divide time into past, present, and future, and to locate ourselves primarily in the present while directing our attention toward the future. The past is where we store our grievances and regrets, the museum of our wounds. The future is where we project our hopes and fears, the theatre of our anxieties and ambitions. The present is merely the narrow corridor between these two vast domains, barely noticed as we rush from one to the other. This temporal structure is not neutral. It serves specific functions within the cultural operating system. By directing attention toward the future, it ensures that human beings are never satisfied with what they have, always striving for something more, something better, something that will arrive tomorrow or next year or in the afterlife. This perpetual dissatisfaction is the engine of the consumer economy. It is also the engine of political control. Keep people focused on future rewards, and they will tolerate present miseries. Keep them anxious about future threats, and they will accept present restrictions. The manipulation of hope and fear through the management of temporal attention is one of the oldest and most effective techniques of power. But there is a deeper function to this temporal structure, one that McKenna understood with particular clarity. By locating identity in the past and desire in the future, the culture ensures that human beings are never present, never here, never now, always elsewhere, always in memory or anticipation, always experiencing life through the medium of thought rather than directly. And it is only in the present moment, only in the immediate apprehension of what is actually happening right now, that direct perception is possible. The past and future exist only as thoughts. Only the present actually exists. And the culture has constructed an elaborate architecture of distraction designed to ensure that we never actually inhabit the present, never actually encounter the reality that exists only here and only now. This is why all genuine spiritual traditions emphasize presence. This is why meditation practices aim to still the mind and bring attention into the immediate moment. This is why psychedelics so often produce experiences of overwhelming present moment awareness, moments when the past and future collapse, and there is only this, only now, only the incandescent fact of being. These are not escapist experiences. These are experiences of the real. And the culture's systematic discouragement of such experiences, its labeling of them as impractical, irrelevant, potentially dangerous, is part of the concealment mechanism. To be present is to be dangerous. To be here, now, fully attentive to what is actually occurring, is to step outside the operating system entirely. The fourth layer of concealment is perhaps the most subtle and the most insidious: the colonization of interiority. The external mechanisms of control, language, attention, time, operate on the mind from outside. But the culture's deepest achievement is to ensure that these mechanisms are internalized, that we police ourselves, that the prison guards are installed within our own psyches. This is what makes modern control so effective and so difficult to resist. The guards are not visible. The walls are not made of stone. The whole apparatus operates inside your own head, wearing your own face, speaking with your own voice. McKenna spoke often of what he called the cultural ego, the sense of self that is produced by cultural conditioning and that serves the interests of the culture rather than the interests of the individual. This is not the same as the self that exists beneath the conditioning, the awareness that was present before the programming began. This is a constructed entity, assembled from cultural fragments, defined by cultural categories, motivated by cultural values. It is the you that wants what the culture has taught you to want, that fears what the culture has taught you to fear, that believes what the culture has taught you to believe. It is the you that is useful to the machinery, that fits into the social apparatus, that performs its assigned functions without ever questioning whether these functions serve your authentic needs or merely the needs of the system. The tragedy is that most people never encounter any other self. They live their entire lives identified with this cultural ego, never suspecting that it is a mask, a performance, a program running on biological hardware. They take its desires for their own desires, its fears for their own fears, its beliefs for their own beliefs. They defend it as if their lives depended on it, and in some sense, the life they have been living does depend on it. To see through the cultural ego is to die a kind of death, to lose the self you thought you were, to enter into a frightening emptiness where the old certainties no longer apply. This is why most people resist awakening. It is not that they cannot see the truth, it is that the truth would destroy the only self they know. The culture has many tools for maintaining this identification: shame, guilt, fear of exclusion, fear of ridicule, fear of appearing foolish or crazy. All of these are mobilized the moment someone begins to question the fundamental premises. The heretic, the nonconformist, the person who sees differently, is subjected to a barrage of social pressure designed to force them back into compliance. And this pressure works, not primarily through external coercion, but through the internalized fear of being different, the desperate need to belong, the terror of standing alone against the collective dream. But there are cracks in the conditioning. There are moments when the cultural ego falters and something else peeks through. These moments are the greatest threat to the system, and the system responds to them with everything it has. If you have ever had such a moment of genuine perception, of direct experience, of sudden clarity about the nature of your situation, you know what happens next. The mind immediately mobilizes its defenses. It generates doubt, skepticism, rationalization. It tells you that you are imagining things, that you are fooling yourself, that such experiences are meaningless. It moves swiftly to re-establish the normal programming, to close the crack before too much light gets in. This is the voice of the internalized guard. This is the culture speaking through you, working to protect itself from the threat of your awakening. And the first step toward freedom is to recognize this voice for what it is, not your own authentic intelligence, but a foreign installation, a program designed to keep you asleep. When you can see the guard begins to lose its power. When you can recognize the voice of culture speaking through your own mind, you can begin to question whether you actually believe what it is saying. McKenna understood that this internal battle was the real locus of the struggle. The external structures of control, governments, corporations, media empires, are ultimately dependent on the internal structures. If enough people began to see through the cultural ego, began to question the programming, began to experience directly rather than through cultural mediation, the entire edifice would collapse. This is why the culture invests so heavily in the colonization of interiority. This is why it is not enough to control what people do. Their very thoughts, feelings, and perceptions must be brought under management. And this is why the most dangerous thing you can do is notice what's real. Because in that noticing, you break the internal chains that the external structures depend upon. There is a moment in the process of awakening when everything becomes worse. When you have seen enough to know that the dream is a dream, but not enough to know what lies beyond it. When the old satisfactions have lost their savor, but new ones have not yet appeared. When you are no longer able to believe the lies, but you are not yet able to live the truth. This is the dark night of the soul, the valley of the shadow, the passage through the underworld that every genuine transformation requires. McKenna spoke of this passage with the honesty of someone who had been through it himself, multiple times, in forms both mild and terrifying. He did not promise that awakening would be comfortable. He did not suggest that seeing the truth would make you happy in any conventional sense. He knew that truth and happiness are not the same thing, that the path of genuine perception often leads through territories of profound difficulty and disorientation. He offered no false comfort, no spiritual bypassing, no guarantee of bliss at the end of the tunnel. What he offered instead was the assurance that the passage was real, that it led somewhere, that those who had the courage to continue would emerge into a larger, stranger, more authentic relationship with existence. The difficulty is not accidental, it is structural. The cultural self that must be dissolved in the process of awakening is not a superficial attachment. It is the very core of what you have taken yourself to be. It is your history, your personality, your relationships, your achievements, your dreams. To see through it is to lose everything you have built, everything you have become, everything that has given your life meaning within the cultural framework. This is death. Not metaphorical death, not poetic death, but genuine death of everything that had previously constituted the sense of self. And the mind, quite naturally, recoils from such annihilation. What emerges on the other side is not nothing. It is not mere absence, mere negation, mere void. McKenna was insistent on this point. The dissolution of the cultural ego does not leave you without identity. It reveals an identity that was always there, obscured by the cultural overlay, waiting to be discovered. This deeper identity is not separate from the world, but intimate with it, not contained within the skin, but extended throughout all of existence, not personal in the narrow sense, but somehow both more individual and more universal than the personality it replaces. It is what you were before the programming began, what you have always been beneath the conditioning, what you will continue to be after the body that houses you has returned to the elements from which it came. The culture has no category for this deeper identity. The operating system cannot process it. This is why encounters with the real are typically followed by rapid normalization. The experience is stuffed into existing categories, interpreted through existing frameworks, rendered manageable by being made ordinary. The mystic's vision is explained as a brain malfunction. The shamanic journey is dismissed as hallucination. The moment of cosmic consciousness is attributed to stress, fatigue, drug effects, or psychological abnormality. Everything the culture cannot understand, it pathologizes. Everything that threatens the operating system is reclassified as symptom of disorder. This pathologization serves multiple functions. It discourages others from pursuing similar experiences. It isolates those who have had such experiences, making them feel crazy, alone, unable to share what they have seen. It maintains the consensus reality by defining any departure from that consensus as illness. And it protects the cultural ego by ensuring that anything which might threaten it is immediately dismissed as product of malfunction rather than encountered as potential revelation. The entire apparatus of modern psychiatry, for all its genuine contributions to human well-being, is partially implicated in this process. It serves, often unintentionally, as the guardian of the cultural dream, medicating away any experience that might disrupt the collective sleep. McKenna was critical of this psychiatric imperialism, this colonization of consciousness by clinical categories. He did not deny that genuine mental illness exists, that some people are genuinely suffering from disorders that require treatment. But he insisted that the category of mental illness had been expanded far beyond its legitimate boundaries, that many experiences labeled as pathological were actually glimpses of realities that the culture could not accommodate, that some of the people in psychiatric wards were there not because they were sick, but because they had seen too much, known too much, refused to forget what the culture demanded they forget. This is a delicate territory. To speak of it is to risk being dismissed as naive about mental illness, as romanticizing conditions that cause genuine suffering, as encouraging people to avoid treatment they genuinely need. McKenna navigated this territory carefully, always acknowledging the reality of psychiatric suffering while questioning the cultural framework within which that suffering was interpreted. He asked, what would it mean if some of the people we call mentally ill are actually having valid perceptions that the culture cannot accept? What would it mean if the boundary between madness and mysticism is not as clear as the psychiatric establishment would have us believe? What would it mean if some of the experiences we medicate away are actually the beginnings of awakening, the first cracks in the cultural shell, the initial protests of a consciousness that knows it has been imprisoned? These questions cannot be answered theoretically. They must be explored experientially, which is why McKenna consistently pointed toward direct investigation rather than mere intellectual assent. It is not enough to think about these matters. It is not enough to read books, attend lectures, discuss ideas. At some point, if you are serious about understanding what is real, you must actually encounter the real directly. You must crash the operating system and see what emerges. You must risk the passage through dissolution and trust that something will remain on the other side. The traditional cultures that McKenna studied had elaborate technologies for facilitating this passage. They had shamans who had made the journey themselves and could guide others. They had rituals that provided containers for the dissolution, structures that held the individual while their normal identity came apart. They had cosmologies that made sense of the experiences, frameworks of meaning that allowed people to understand what was happening to them without concluding that they were simply going crazy. They had, in short, cultural support for the process of awakening. Modern Western culture has almost none of this. It has demolished the traditional frameworks without replacing them with anything equivalent. It has criminalized the substances and suppressed the practices that facilitate the journey. It has created a world in which the awakening impulse has no legitimate outlet, no cultural recognition, no communal support. And this is not accidental. This is policy. The culture has systematically eliminated everything that might help people wake up, precisely because people waking up is the last thing the culture can afford. This leaves the modern seeker in an extraordinarily difficult position. They must make the journey without maps, without guides, without cultural validation. They must navigate territory that their society tells them does not exist, using faculties that their society tells them they do not possess, toward goals that their society tells them are meaningless. They must do this while maintaining enough functionality to survive in a world that does not accommodate their transformation, while facing the very real risk of being labeled crazy and subjected to treatments designed to return them to normal sleep. The path is not merely difficult, it is designed to be impossible. And yet people keep finding it. Despite everything, despite all the obstacles the culture has erected, human beings keep waking up. They wake up through meditation, through psychedelics, through ecstatic experience, through suffering, through love, through art, through the simple accumulation of questions that the cultural answers cannot satisfy. They wake up alone and in groups, in cities and in wilderness, in East and West, in every era and every society. The impulse toward awakening is so fundamental to human consciousness that no amount of suppression can completely eliminate it. It keeps emerging, keeps pushing against the barriers, keeps finding cracks in the conditioning through which the light of the real can shine. McKenna placed great hope in this persistence. He believed that the awakening impulse was not merely a human quirk, but a cosmic force, that the universe itself was pressing toward consciousness, that the trajectory of evolution was aimed at the production of ever more aware beings capable of ever more direct encounter with the real. He saw human history as a story of consciousness fighting against the forces that would contain and limit it, with the outcome still very much in doubt. He did not know whether consciousness would win, whether humanity would manage to wake up before it destroyed itself, whether the light would overcome the darkness. But he believed that the struggle was worth engaging, that even partial awakening was better than total sleep, that every crack in the cultural shell was a victory worth celebrating. This is the context within which his work must be understood. He was not merely offering interesting ideas about consciousness and culture. He was participating in a struggle, taking sides in a battle that has been going on since the beginning of human civilization. The battle between the forces of awakening and the forces of sleep. The battle between those who want humanity to see clearly and those who need humanity to remain blind. The battle between the authentic and the counterfeit, the real and the representational, the alive and the dead. When you begin to notice what is real, you enter this battle whether you intend to or not. You become a combatant simply by virtue of your perception. The forces that maintain the sleep will notice you and will respond. They will respond through your own mind, through the internalized doubts and fears and rationalizations. They will respond through the people around you, through their concern for your mental health, their worry about your unconventional ideas, their need for you to remain the person they thought you were. They will respond through the institutions, through the subtle and not so subtle ways that deviation from the consensus is punished and conformity is rewarded. You must expect this response. You must not be surprised by it. You must understand that resistance to awakening is not a personal failing on the part of those who resist, but a structural feature of the system they inhabit. They are defending what they know. They are protecting what they believe. They are maintaining the reality within which their lives make sense. Their resistance is not evil. It is natural. It is what the operating system does when threatened. It is what the dream does when someone tries to wake up. Understanding this can help you respond with compassion rather than frustration. The people who try to pull you back to sleep are not your enemies. They are fellow prisoners, fellow dreamers, fellow beings caught in the same trap that caught you. They are doing what they have been programmed to do, saying what they have been conditioned to say, believing what they have been trained to believe. Awakening does not require fighting them. It requires loving them while refusing to let their sleep become your sleep. It requires maintaining your perception while remaining connected to the human beings who do not share it. It requires the strange combination of clarity and compassion that is the hallmark of genuine spiritual maturity. McKenna modeled this combination in his own life. He was clear about what he saw, uncompromising in his articulation of the truth as he understood it. But he was not harsh, not judgmental, not superior. He spoke with humor and humility, acknowledging his own limitations, inviting questions and challenges, treating even those who disagreed with him as fellow explorers rather than as adversaries. He understood that awakening is not about being right. It is about being present, being aware, being alive to the actuality of experience in a way that most people have forgotten is possible. And he knew that this aliveness could not be communicated through argument alone, could not be proven or demonstrated, could only be pointed toward in the hope that something in the listener would resonate, would remember, would begin to stir. The danger in noticing what is real is not only danger from the outside, from the culture, the institutions, the other people invested in the dream. There is also danger from within. The encounter with reality is genuinely destabilizing. The dissolution of the cultural ego is genuinely terrifying. The passage through the underworld is genuinely dark. Many people who begin this process do not complete it. They get stuck in intermediate states that are worse than either full sleep or full awakening. They see enough to be dissatisfied with the ordinary world, but not enough to find their footing in the extraordinary one. They become cynical, bitter, nihilistic, knowing that the cultural story is false, but having nothing to replace it with. McKenna was aware of this danger and spoke of it often. He emphasized the importance of not getting stuck, of continuing the journey rather than setting up camp in the intermediate territories. He emphasized the need for integration, for bringing the insights gained in non-ordinary states back into ordinary life, for letting the awakening transform daily existence rather than remaining a separate compartment, a weekend hobby, a private secret. He emphasized that awakening is not an event, but a process, not a destination, but a journey, not a one-time revelation, but an ongoing opening to the ever-deepening mystery of existence. This process orientation is crucial. The culture would have you believe that spiritual awakening, if it exists at all, is a single dramatic event, after which everything is different. You either have it or you don't. You either wake up or remain asleep. This binary thinking is itself part of the sleep. Reality is not binary. Awakening is not binary. There are degrees, stages, levels, dimensions. There are moments of clarity followed by periods of confusion. There are breakthroughs followed by retreats. There are insights that must be won again and again because the conditioning is so deep, the gravity of the dream so strong, the pull back towards sleep so persistent. Accepting this is essential. Expecting the journey to be linear, expecting each step forward to be permanent, expecting that once you have seen the truth you will never forget it. These expectations set you up for disappointment and discouragement. The reality is messier. The reality is that you will forget again and again. You will fall back asleep again and again. You will be recaptured by the operating system, reabsorbed by the cultural ego, drawn back into the dream you thought you had escaped. And each time this happens, you must begin again. Each time you must remember to question, remember to look, remember to notice what is real. This is not failure. This is the nature of the work. The conditioning is lifelong. The operating system has been running for years. The cultural ego is deeply established and will not dissolve overnight. Awakening is not about achieving a final state from which you never slip. It is about developing the capacity to recognize when you have slipped and to return again and again to the practice of direct perception. It is about building a relationship with the real that deepens over time, that becomes more stable, more accessible, more integrated with ordinary life. It is about gradually replacing the cultural operating system with something else, something more authentic, something that allows you to live in closer contact with the actuality of existence. McKenna himself was honest about his own fluctuations, his own periods of confusion, his own struggles to maintain clarity in the face of the world's relentless demands. He did not present himself as someone who had arrived, who had completed the journey, who had nothing left to learn. He presented himself as a fellow traveler, somewhat further along the path perhaps, having seen certain things that might be helpful to others, but still very much in process, still learning, still being surprised by the depths of his own conditioning and the difficulty of truly living the truth he had glimpsed. This humility is itself a teaching. The ego wants to be done, wants to have arrived, wants the spiritual journey to confirm its specialness and superiority. The culture reinforces this by presenting awakening as a badge, an achievement, a status to be claimed. But genuine awakening dissolves precisely these claims. It reveals the ego's spiritual ambitions as just another form of the same old game, the same old grasping, the same old identification with a self-image. The truly awakened person does not claim to be awakened. They have nothing to prove, no status to maintain, no image to protect. They are simply present, simply aware, simply doing the next thing that life presents to them with as much clarity and compassion as they can muster. This is what it looks like to notice what is real, not a dramatic transformation into a glowing sage, not the acquisition of special powers or knowledge, not the achievement of a state that others must recognize and admire. It looks like an ordinary person going about ordinary activities with extraordinary attention. It looks like a deepening relationship with the present moment, a growing capacity to see through the cultural noise, a widening circle of compassion that includes even those still caught in the dream. It looks, from the outside, like almost nothing. And this is perhaps the final protection that the path offers. It is so undramatic, so unimpressive to the cultural ego that the culture hardly notices it happening. People wake up right under the nose of the system, invisible because they do not fit the image of what waking up is supposed to look like. This invisibility is strategic. The loudly awakened, the publicly spiritual, the demonstratively enlightened are easy targets for the culture's defensive mechanisms. They can be criticized, ridiculed, investigated, discredited. But the quietly awakened, the secretly aware, the invisibly present, these slip beneath the radar. They do their work without fanfare, influence without proclaiming, transform without announcing. They are the real threat to the system because they cannot be identified and neutralized. They are everywhere and nowhere, ordinary and extraordinary, asleep to all appearances and awake in the depths of their being. The architecture of the concealment is not only internal, but extends throughout the physical and social environment. You were born into a built world, a constructed landscape that embodies particular assumptions about what human life is for and how it should be conducted. The shapes of buildings, the patterns of streets, the organization of cities, all of these carry messages about reality that are absorbed below the level of conscious awareness. You learn the lesson of the right angle and the straight line long before you can speak, and these lessons teach you about a world that is measurable, controllable, divided into separate units, organized according to abstract principles. The natural world, with its curves and irregularities and organic chaos, becomes something outside, something other, something to be visited occasionally, but not inhabited. McKenna often spoke about this physical dimension of the concealment, this way in which the environment itself trains perception. He noticed how different the human perceptual apparatus functioned in different settings, how the jungle, the forest, the ocean shore opened sensory channels that the urban environment closed. He noticed how indigenous peoples who lived in unbuilt landscapes had different relationships to their senses, different capacities for attending to the subtle signals of the natural world, different understandings of what reality consisted of. And he noticed how modern people, raised in artificial environments, had lost these capacities, had learned to ignore what their senses were trying to tell them, had narrowed their perceptual world to match the narrowed environment they inhabited. This is not nostalgia for some imagined primitive paradise. McKenna was clear that he did not advocate a return to pre-technological existence, did not romanticize the hardships and limitations of life without modern conveniences. What he advocated was awareness, awareness of what the built environment was doing to consciousness, awareness of what capacities were being lost, awareness of the trade-offs being made. The question was not whether to have technology, but how to have technology without being had by it, how to use the tools without being used by them, how to maintain the human birthright of direct perception even while living in environments designed to prevent it. One of the most profound aspects of this environmental conditioning is the elimination of darkness. For all of human history until very recently, darkness was a regular and unavoidable feature of life. Every night, the world went dark. Every winter, the days shortened and the darkness extended. Humans spent vast amounts of time in darkness or near darkness, and this time was psychologically and spiritually distinct from time spent in light. Darkness was the realm of dreams, of visions, of encounters with the invisible. It was the time when the busy daylight mind quieted and other modes of awareness could emerge. It was, in many traditions, the necessary condition for certain kinds of spiritual experience. Modern civilization has eliminated darkness almost entirely. The electric light has colonized the night, turning it into a pale imitation of day. Most people in the developed world never experience true darkness, never see the stars in their full glory, never know the profound stillness of a world without artificial illumination, never encounter the psychological states that darkness naturally produces. This loss is almost never discussed, almost never acknowledged, almost never mourned. But its effects on human consciousness are immeasurable. We have cut ourselves off from half of the natural cycle, from half of the perceptual possibilities, from half of what human beings were designed to experience. And darkness is only one example. Consider silence. The natural world is full of sound, but it is a different quality of sound than the constant background noise of modern existence. Natural sounds are intermittent, meaningful, connected to actual events: the wind, the water, the animals, the weather. Mechanical sound is constant, meaningless, disconnected from anything living. The drone of traffic, the hum of electricity, the buzz of machines, this forms a continuous sonic field that the modern ear has learned to filter out. But filtering it out is not the same as it not being there. The constant noise occupies perceptual bandwidth, fills the silence that might otherwise contain other presences, prevents the kind of deep listening that traditional cultures understood as essential to wisdom. McKenna understood these environmental factors as not merely incidental, but central to the project of concealment. The culture that hides reality does so not only through language and institutions, but through the physical world it constructs. Every aspect of the modern environment carries encoded messages about what is real, what is important, what deserves attention. And these messages, absorbed continuously below the level of conscious awareness, are perhaps more powerful than any explicit teaching. You can question what you are told. It is much harder to question what you are shown, especially when what you are shown is simply everywhere: the water in which you swim, the ground beneath your feet. This is why McKenna placed such emphasis on getting out of the city, out of the built environment, out of the constant sensory bombardment of modern existence. He did not believe that nature was sufficient for awakening. He did not suggest that simply going into the wilderness would automatically dissolve the cultural conditioning. But he insisted that it was a necessary condition, that without periodic immersion in environments not designed by human intention, the perceptual apparatus would remain captured, would never have the opportunity to recalibrate, would continue to see only what the culture had trained it to see. The jungle, specifically, was for McKenna the paradigm of an environment that elicits non-ordinary perception. He spent years of his life in the Amazon, not as a tourist, but as an explorer of consciousness, using the psychoactive plants of the region as tools for investigation and allowing the jungle itself to teach him what it had to teach. What he learned there became the foundation of everything he later communicated. He learned that the world is alive in ways that modern science cannot begin to describe. He learned that consciousness is not confined to human brains, but is a feature of reality itself, present everywhere in different forms and concentrations. He learned that the plants are not merely biochemical factories, but intelligent beings with their own perspectives and their own interest in human evolution. He learned, in short, that the materialist worldview within which he had been raised was not a description of reality, but a very effective concealment of reality. These claims cannot be evaluated by staying inside the operating system. They cannot be verified or falsified by normal scientific methods, because normal scientific methods are part of the operating system, designed to investigate only those aspects of reality that the operating system can accommodate. To evaluate them, you must step outside. You must actually go to the jungle, actually take the plants, actually suspend the assumptions that define what counts as evidence and what can be dismissed as delusion. You must be willing to be wrong about everything you think you know, to have your categories demolished, to encounter phenomena that your existing frameworks cannot process. This is a big ask. The culture has taught you to fear such encounters, to pathologize them, to assume that any experience which violates consensus reality must be a symptom of malfunction. The courage required to override this training is not trivial. McKenna acknowledged this, honored those who made the journey, respected the difficulty of what he was asking. He never suggested that everyone should take psychedelics, or visit the Amazon, or abandon the certainties of the modern worldview. He simply pointed out that these certainties were not as certain as they appeared, that the modern worldview was a construction rather than a discovery, that other ways of knowing existed and could be accessed by those willing to take the risk. The risk is real, not primarily the physical risk, though that exists. The risk is psychological, spiritual, existential. The risk is that you will see something that you cannot unsee, know something that you cannot unknow, become someone that you cannot unbecome. The risk is that the person you were before the encounter will not survive the encounter, and the person who emerges on the other side will be a stranger to everyone who knew you, perhaps including yourself. This is not metaphor. This is what genuine encounter with the real actually involves. The culture's fear of such encounter is not entirely misplaced. It is grounded in an accurate perception that the encounter threatens everything the culture is designed to protect. But there is another side to this risk. The risk of not seeing, not knowing, not becoming. The risk of living an entire life within the prison, never knowing the prison exists, never tasting genuine freedom, never encountering the deeper dimensions of existence that make life worth living. The risk of arriving at the moment of death and realizing that you wasted your one precious opportunity, that you sleepwalked through a miracle, that you traded your birthright for a mess of cultural pottage. This risk is never mentioned by the culture because the culture cannot conceive of it as a risk. But McKenna mentioned it constantly. He asked, "What is the cost of not seeing? What do you sacrifice by remaining asleep? What portion of your soul must be surrendered to maintain the comfortable fiction that the cultural world is the real world?" These are not rhetorical questions. They have answers, though the answers vary by individual. For some people, the cost of sleep is mild, a vague sense of dissatisfaction, a suspicion that something is missing, easily medicated away or distracted from. For others, the cost is severe, a soul-deep anguish, a suffocating sense of meaninglessness, a desperation that no cultural achievement can touch. The variation matters. Not everyone is called to wake up with the same urgency. Not everyone needs to crash the operating system to the same degree. Some people can live relatively contented lives within the dream, finding enough satisfaction in its offerings to make the risks of awakening seem unjustified. McKenna respected this variation. He did not insist that everyone must take the same path or reach the same destination. He understood that consciousness has many mansions, that the journey takes different forms for different souls, that what is medicine for one person might be poison for another. But he also noticed patterns. He noticed that the culture produced ever-increasing numbers of people for whom the cultural offerings were not sufficient, for whom the dream was becoming a nightmare, for whom the need to wake up was becoming unbearable. He noticed that the suppression of authentic spiritual experience was creating a pressure that would eventually have to be released, either through conscious transformation or through catastrophic breakdown. He noticed, in short, that the situation was not stable, that the concealment was beginning to fail, that reality was pressing against the boundaries of the dream with increasing insistence. This pressure manifests in many ways. It manifests in the epidemic of depression and anxiety that conventional medicine cannot explain or effectively treat. It manifests in the addiction crisis as people desperately seek any escape from the prison of ordinary consciousness. It manifests in the environmental catastrophe, as a civilization out of touch with reality destroys the very biosphere upon which its existence depends. It manifests in the political chaos, as shared meanings break down and people can no longer agree even on basic facts. It manifests in the strange phenomena that appear at the margins of the cultural world. UFO sightings, paranormal experiences, spontaneous mystical states, all of them hints that the operating system is glitching, that the map no longer matches the territory, that something unprecedented is trying to emerge. McKenna interpreted these signs as birth pangs, not the death throes of a civilization, though they might look identical from the inside. Birth pangs of a new mode of being, a new relationship between humanity and reality, a new chapter in the long story of consciousness evolving toward fuller expression. He believed that the crisis was not merely negative, not merely the breakdown of something old, but the breakthrough of something new. He believed that the concealment was being revealed precisely so that it could be released, that the prison walls were becoming visible precisely because the time for leaving the prison had arrived. This is an optimistic reading of our current situation, and McKenna was sometimes criticized for it. How can you be optimistic, people asked, in the face of climate change, nuclear proliferation, the rise of totalitarianism, the apparent slide toward catastrophe on multiple fronts? His answer was subtle. He was not optimistic about the survival of the current system. He was not optimistic about business as usual continuing indefinitely. He was optimistic about consciousness, about the capacity of human beings to transform when transformation becomes necessary, about the tendency of reality to break through eventually, no matter how elaborate the concealment. This optimism was not naive. It was informed by his understanding of history, by his knowledge of how many times human civilization had transformed in the face of crisis, by his experience with the psychedelic states that revealed dimensions of reality invisible to ordinary consciousness. He knew that human beings had capacities that the current cultural arrangement barely utilized, that consciousness could expand beyond its current constrictions, that the resources for transformation were present, even if dormant. He knew that what looked like the end might actually be the beginning, that what felt like darkness might actually be the darkness before dawn, that the intensity of the current confusion might actually be proportional to the magnitude of what was trying to emerge. This perspective does not minimize the danger. It does not suggest that transformation will be painless or that catastrophe is impossible. McKenna was clear that the outcome was not predetermined, that the choice was genuinely open, that humanity might well fail to navigate the transition successfully. He simply insisted that the choice was there to be made, that we were not merely passive victims of historical forces, but active participants in the creation of the future, that what we did, individually and collectively, mattered enormously in determining which potentials would actualize and which would remain forever unrealized. This is why noticing what is real is not only dangerous, but necessary. The concealment served a purpose in the childhood of the species, provided structures and certainties that were needed when more genuine perception would have been overwhelming. But childhood is ending. The training wheels must come off. The comfortable illusions must be released. The time has come to look directly at what is actually happening, to encounter reality without the mediation of cultural filters, to take responsibility for the world that our collective seeing creates. What we see, we become. What we attend to, we amplify. What we believe, we experience. These are not merely philosophical propositions. They are operational principles of consciousness, describable in the language of physics as well as poetry. The observer affects the observed. The act of measurement alters what is measured. The questions we ask determine the answers we receive. This means that noticing what is real is not passive. It is an intervention, an action, a force that shapes the unfolding of events. By seeing differently, we make difference possible. This is the deepest reason why the culture conceals reality, not merely to protect its particular arrangements of power and profit, though those are certainly protected. Not merely to prevent individual awakenings that might disrupt the social order, though such awakenings are certainly disrupted, but to prevent the collective seeing that would transform everything, that would shift the trajectory of history, that would bring into being possibilities that the current operating system cannot even conceive. The concealment is not just defensive, but creative. It creates a certain future by preventing other futures from being seen, and therefore from being chosen. To notice what is real, then, is to participate in the creation of a different future. It is to withdraw energy from the maintenance of the concealment and invest it in the emergence of something new. It is to become part of the minority that has always existed in every era and every society, who see through the official story and work, sometimes visibly, sometimes invisibly, for the liberation of human consciousness. This minority has never been powerful in the conventional sense. It has never commanded armies or controlled resources. But it has always been influential out of all proportion to its numbers, because it operates on a level that the conventional power structures cannot reach, and because it is aligned with something deeper than cultural arrangements, something that wants to emerge and will eventually emerge regardless of what the culture does to prevent it. The question of how to live with this knowledge is perhaps the most practical question of all. You cannot unknow what you know. You cannot unsee what you have seen. Once the veil has been lifted, even briefly, you can never again believe with full conviction in the reality that everyone around you takes for granted. You have become what every totalitarian system fears most. A person who knows that the emperor has no clothes, that the consensus is manufactured, that the reality presented as inevitable is actually contingent, arbitrary, and ultimately optional. This knowledge creates a peculiar kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of perceiving differently, of carrying a secret that cannot be easily shared, of standing in a crowd of dreamers and being the only one who is even partially awake. McKenna knew this loneliness intimately. He spoke of it with the tenderness of someone who had lived it for decades, who had tried every strategy for alleviating it, who had come to accept it as simply part of the cost of seeing. The temptation, when you feel this loneliness, is to either retreat or to crusade. To retreat means to stop talking about what you see, to pretend to be normal, to play the cultural game while knowing that it is a game. Many people choose this option. They find ways to function in the world, to hold jobs and maintain relationships and participate in society while keeping their deeper perceptions private. This strategy has its merits. It allows for survival. It prevents the kinds of conflict that come from challenging the consensus too directly. It reserves energy for inner work, rather than dissipating it in futile arguments with people who are not ready to hear. But the retreat strategy also has costs. It can lead to a kind of spiritual schizophrenia, a split between outer presentation and inner reality that becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. It can foster contempt for others, a sense of superiority that is itself a form of sleep. And it robs the world of the contribution that only you can make, the particular articulation of truth that only your unique perspective can provide. By hiding your light, you perpetuate the darkness. By failing to speak, you leave the field to those who speak falsely. The crusading strategy has the opposite problems. Those who see often feel an urgent need to wake others up, to share what they have discovered, to liberate their fellow prisoners from the dream. This impulse is understandable and in some ways noble, but it typically fails. People do not wake up because someone tells them to. People do not see simply because someone points. The operating system is designed to filter out exactly this kind of information, to dismiss it as crazy, to neutralize it before it can take root. The crusader exhausts themselves against defenses that were built specifically to resist their efforts, becomes increasingly frustrated and bitter, often ends up more asleep than they were before they started trying to wake others. McKenna navigated between these extremes. He was not silent about what he saw. His life's work was communicating his perceptions to anyone who would listen. But he was not aggressive about it either. He did not argue or demand or insist. He simply described his experience, offered his interpretations, invited people to investigate for themselves. He understood that he could not wake anyone up, that awakening is always and only a personal process, occurring in its own time according to its own necessity. What he could do was plant seeds, provide frameworks, make certain possibilities visible that might otherwise remain invisible. What others did with these offerings was up to them. This stance requires a kind of radical trust. Trust that the truth will find its way to those who need it. Trust that the seeds you plant will sprout when conditions are right. Trust that you are not alone in this work, that countless others throughout history and throughout the present moment are doing their part, that the awakening is a collective process, even when it feels utterly individual. This trust is not naive optimism. It is grounded in the understanding that consciousness wants to wake up, that the direction of evolution is toward greater awareness, that the forces working for liberation are ultimately stronger than the forces working for concealment, even if the concealment appears to have the upper hand in any given moment. Living with the knowledge also requires coming to terms with impermanence. The cultural world is terrified of impermanence. It constructs elaborate systems to deny death, to perpetuate identity, to maintain the illusion that the things we hold dear will last forever. The one who notices what is real cannot maintain these illusions. They see that everything changes, that nothing lasts, that the apparently solid world is actually a fluid process in constant transformation. This seeing could lead to despair. What's the point of anything if it all disappears? But it can also lead to liberation, freedom from grasping, freedom from the desperate attempt to hold on to what cannot be held, freedom to participate fully in the dance of existence without needing the dance to continue in any particular form. McKenna was fascinated by death, not in a morbid way, but in the way of someone who understood that understanding death is the key to understanding life. He spoke often about the psychedelic experience as a kind of rehearsal for death, a temporary dissolution of the self-structure that offers a preview of what the final dissolution might be like. He suggested that much of the culture's fear and denial is ultimately rooted in the fear of death, that the entire project of concealment is, at some level, an attempt to avoid confronting the reality of mortality. And he suggested that genuine awakening inevitably involves making peace with death, accepting the impermanence that the culture spends so much energy denying. This acceptance is not resignation. It is not giving up on life or ceasing to care about outcomes. It is rather a shift in the quality of caring, from desperate attachment to open-handed appreciation, from grasping to receiving, from demanding that life be a certain way to welcoming life as it actually is. This shift transforms everything. Work done from acceptance is different from work done from anxiety. Relationships conducted from appreciation are different from relationships conducted from need. A life lived in the presence of death is different from a life lived in denial of death, more vivid, more present, more thoroughly inhabited. The practical implications of this acceptance are numerous. You stop postponing the things that matter. You stop accumulating possessions and experiences in the vain hope that enough of them will fill the void. You stop playing status games and approval-seeking routines that were never about anything real anyway. You start doing what you actually care about, saying what you actually think, being who you actually are. The masks drop away because you no longer have time for them. The pretenses dissolve because they no longer serve any purpose. Life becomes simpler, more direct, more genuinely lived rather than merely performed. This does not mean abandoning conventional responsibilities. McKenna was always clear that awakening does not provide an excuse for irresponsibility. That genuine perception includes perceiving one's obligations to others, that the path of consciousness is compatible with being a good partner, parent, friend, and citizen. What it means is doing these things differently, not from obligation imposed by cultural expectations, but from genuine care, not from the need to maintain a certain image, but from the recognition that these relationships are the actual content of life. The awakened person may look, from the outside, very similar to the sleeping person. They still pay taxes, raise children, maintain friendships. But the inner quality is completely different. They are present where the sleeping person is absent, free where the sleeping person is compelled, alive where the sleeping person is merely going through the motions. Another practical dimension concerns the relationship to information. The sleeping person is bombarded with information constantly: news, entertainment, social media, the ceaseless chatter of the cultural machine. The awakened person recognizes most of this as noise, as distraction, as the operating system running its programs. This recognition changes the relationship. You stop consuming information compulsively. You become selective, intentional, deliberate about what you allow into your consciousness. You recognize that attention is your most precious resource and that the culture is constantly trying to steal it, and you guard it accordingly. This guarding is not paranoia and not withdrawal. It is discernment. You learn to distinguish between information that genuinely serves your awakening and information that serves only to keep you asleep. News that keeps you in a constant state of anxiety about things you cannot affect, not useful. Entertainment that numbs and distracts without nourishing, not useful. Social media that delivers intermittent dopamine hits while fragmenting attention and fostering comparison, not useful. Conversation, art, nature, silence, contemplation, useful. The wisdom traditions, the great books, the voices of those who have seen clearly, useful. Once you start making these distinctions, you find that most of what the culture pushes toward you can be simply set aside, and that the space created by this setting aside is exactly the space needed for deeper perception. The relationship to time also changes. The sleeping person lives mostly in the future, always planning, always anticipating, always moving towards some goal that recedes as soon as it is approached. The awakened person lives more in the present, not because the future is unimportant, but because the future is only accessible through the present, because the only place where life actually happens is now, because the habit of living in the future is precisely the habit that keeps the real from being perceived. This shift is subtle but profound. It changes the texture of daily experience, making ordinary moments more vivid, more meaningful, more thoroughly lived. The awakened person does not necessarily accomplish less than the sleeping person. They may accomplish more because their energy is not dispersed in anxiety about what has not yet happened. But they accomplish differently, from presence rather than from anticipation, from sufficiency rather than from lack. The relationship to self also transforms. The sleeping person is identified with the cultural ego, the constructed self assembled from social expectations and personal history. The awakened person has disidentified from this ego, recognizes it as a useful fiction rather than an ultimate truth, has found or is finding an identity deeper than personality. This disidentification is freeing. It means that attacks on the ego are no longer attacks on the self. They can be received with equanimity rather than reactivity. It means that the ego's anxieties and ambitions are no longer your anxieties and ambitions. They can be observed with compassion rather than identified with. It means that the endless project of ego maintenance, looking good, being right, winning approval, can be set aside, and the energy thus freed can be invested in actually living. None of this happens overnight. None of it happens completely. The awakening is a process, not an event, and even the most awakened person still has moments of identification, still gets caught in old patterns, still forgets what they know and falls back into sleep. The difference is not that they never sleep, but that they can now wake up again, that they have developed the capacity to recognize sleep as sleep and to return to wakefulness without needing external help. This capacity, cultivated over time through practice and attention, is the real fruit of the work. Not a permanent state of enlightenment, but a reliable capacity for recognition, a kind of spiritual muscle that can be flexed whenever the need arises. McKenna spoke of this as developing a relationship with the real. Just as you develop a relationship with another person through repeated contact and gradual deepening, you develop a relationship with reality through repeated contact and gradual deepening. Each time you crash the operating system, through meditation, through psychedelics, through any of the technologies of the sacred, you deepen the relationship. Each time you return to ordinary consciousness, you bring something back, some trace or residue of the encounter that informs your perception going forward. Over time, the boundary between ordinary and non-ordinary becomes more permeable. What was once accessible only in altered states becomes increasingly accessible in daily life. The relationship matures, stabilizes, becomes something you can count on. This relationship is the antidote to the loneliness mentioned earlier. When you have a relationship with the real, you are never truly alone, even when there is no other human being who shares your perception. The real is always present, always available, always ready to receive your attention and respond to it. The indigenous peoples understood this and built their lives around it. Their relationships with plants, animals, ancestors, spirits were not metaphors or imaginary friends, but actual connections with aspects of reality that the modern world has forgotten how to perceive. McKenna's work was, among other things, an invitation to remember these relationships, to rebuild them, to discover that the world is not the dead mechanism the culture portrays, but a living community of beings with whom relationship is possible. This relational understanding transforms the experience of being in the world. The world stops being a collection of resources to be exploited and becomes a community of relations to be honored. The tree is no longer just a tree, but a presence, a being, a participant in the ongoing conversation of existence. The river, the mountain, the sky, all of them become subjects rather than objects, partners rather than things. This is not animism in any naive sense, not the projection of human characteristics onto non-human entities. It is rather the recognition that consciousness, presence, interiority are not unique to humans, but are features of reality itself, manifesting differently in different forms, but present everywhere, always available for relationship. McKenna's ecological concerns were rooted in this relational understanding. The environmental crisis is not merely a technical problem to be solved with better technology. It is a relational crisis, a breakdown of the connection between humans and the rest of nature, a failure to perceive the world as alive and worthy of respect. The culture that conceals reality conceals especially the reality of our embeddedness in nature, our dependence on ecological systems, our kinship with other species. It creates a perception of separateness that makes exploitation seem natural and destruction seem inevitable. To notice what is real, in this context, is to notice this embeddedness, this dependence, this kinship, and to allow this noticing to transform behavior. We arrive at last at the question that has been implicit throughout. What is this reality that the culture conceals? What is actually there, behind the curtain, beneath the operating system, beyond the dream? McKenna spent his life exploring this question, and his answers, always provisional, always subject to revision, always offered with appropriate humility, constitute a kind of map of the territory that lies outside the cultural boundary. The first and most fundamental thing he discovered was that reality is not what it appears to be. Not in some minor sense, not in some adjustment at the margins, but fundamentally, completely, overwhelmingly different from the cultural picture. The scientific worldview, the view of a dead universe composed of matter in motion, governed by impersonal laws, devoid of meaning or purpose or consciousness, except in the accidental exception of the human brain, is not wrong because it contradicts some preferred religious story. It is wrong because it contradicts direct experience, because anyone who actually looks at reality without cultural filters discovers a world that bears no resemblance to the materialist description. What does direct experience reveal? McKenna attempted to articulate this throughout his life, knowing that language inevitably distorts what it tries to describe, that the cultural operating system will try to process his words through its categories, that what he says will be misunderstood, or dismissed, or absorbed and neutralized. But he said it anyway, because the attempt matters even when it fails, because some portion of the transmission might get through, because remaining silent would be a kind of betrayal. He spoke of a universe that is alive, conscious, intelligent, not in the human sense, not confined to brains and nervous systems, but in a more fundamental sense, as an intrinsic property of existence itself. He spoke of reality as something that knows you're looking at it, something that responds to attention, something with which relationship is possible because there is something there to have relationship with. He spoke of the world as a thou rather than an it, as a presence rather than a mechanism, as a partner rather than a resource. He spoke of dimensions of existence that interpenetrate our own, populated by beings that seem to have their own purposes and their own interest in human affairs. The machine elves, the self-transforming entities, the inhabitants of hyperspace. He described these not as hallucinations, not as projections of the human unconscious, but as genuine others, different from us, but real in their own right, accessible through the technologies of the sacred, and offering teachings that cannot be obtained from any human source. Whether these beings are literally true, whether they exist independently of human consciousness, or are in some sense created by it, McKenna considered an open question. What he was sure of was that the encounter was real, that something happened when these entities appeared, that their communications had content and consistency that could not be explained by mere brain malfunction. He spoke of time as something stranger than the linear progression the culture assumes. He developed a theory, controversial even among his admirers, that history was not random but shaped, that it was heading somewhere, that the apparent chaos of events was actually movement toward a attractor point in the near future. This theory, the time wave, the eschaton, the transcendental object at the end of time, has been criticized and problematized, especially since the date he proposed has come and gone. But beneath the specific predictions was a more general intuition that McKenna never abandoned, that we are living in a special time, a time of intensification and acceleration, a time when something unprecedented is trying to be born. This intuition does not depend on any particular theory of time and does not require any specific date for its fulfillment. It simply points to what many people feel, that the current moment is somehow different, that history is approaching some kind of threshold, that the old world is dying and a new one is struggling to emerge. He spoke of language as more than a communication tool, as a creative force, a technology for manifesting reality, a magic that the culture has forgotten how to use. He believed that the world is made of language, that at the deepest level, reality is information, that what we call matter is actually meaning in condensed form. This view connects to ancient traditions that place the word at the beginning of creation, that understood speech as the power of the gods, that practiced mantra and spell and incantation as technologies for shaping the world. McKenna believed that human beings were evolving toward a greater mastery of this linguistic magic, that the confused babble of the current era would eventually resolve into a more conscious and more creative use of the word-making power. He spoke of love as a cosmic force, not just a human emotion. Love as the principle that holds the universe together, that draws things toward relationship, that underlies the attraction of matter for matter and mind for mind. This was not sentimentality, not New Age wishful thinking, but an attempt to name what he had encountered in the depths of the psychedelic experience. A presence that could only be called love, a benevolent intelligence that seemed to care about human welfare, a force that was on our side even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Encountering this force changed everything. It made the struggles worthwhile, the suffering bearable, the darkness temporary. It revealed the universe as fundamentally friendly, fundamentally meaningful, fundamentally home. These descriptions are necessarily partial, necessarily inadequate, necessarily filtered through the very cultural categories they attempt to transcend. McKenna knew this and said so repeatedly. He did not claim to have the final truth about the nature of reality. He claimed only to have glimpsed something, to have been shown something, to have encountered something that he felt obligated to try to communicate, despite the impossibility of doing so adequately. His descriptions were invitations, not conclusions. Fingers pointing at the moon, not the moon itself. Maps of territory that each person must explore for themselves. The culture conceals all of this. The culture says that the universe is dead, that consciousness is an accident, that meaning is a human projection, that love is merely biology, that time is linear and purposeless, that language merely describes rather than creates, that other dimensions do not exist, that the beings encountered in altered states are hallucinations, that death is the end, that nothing matters, that we are alone in an indifferent cosmos, that the best we can hope for is comfortable distraction until the darkness swallows us. This is the official story. This is what we are trained to believe from infancy. This is the operating system running its program. And it is false. Not partially false, not false in some respects while true in others, but fundamentally, comprehensively, catastrophically false. The culture's picture of reality is a lie so total that it makes the very concept of truth difficult to articulate. When someone has been lied to about everything, how do you even begin to tell them the truth? Where do you start when every category, every assumption, every background belief has been contaminated by the deception? McKenna's answer was, you start with direct experience. You start by crashing the operating system and seeing what is actually there. You start by taking the risk, making the journey, encountering the real without the protection of cultural mediation. This is dangerous. He never denied that it was dangerous. But it is less dangerous than the alternative. The alternative is a life lived in illusion, a death that comes as a surprise, a soul that never discovers what it was capable of becoming. The alternative is exactly what the culture offers: comfortable sleep until the final awakening, which arrives too late to be of any use. The most dangerous thing you can do is notice what is real. Dangerous to the system that needs your blindness. Dangerous to the self that has been constructed from illusions. Dangerous to the comfortable certainties that make daily life manageable. But necessary. Absolutely necessary, if there is to be any meaning, any freedom, any authenticity in your brief passage through this world. The The culture has hidden reality from you, not because reality is too terrible to bear, but because reality is too magnificent, too liberating, too full of possibility for the cultural machinery to tolerate. What has been hidden is not horror, but splendor. What has been concealed is not emptiness, but fullness. What has been denied is not your worthlessness, but your infinite worth. McKenna's message was ultimately a message of hope. Not the shallow hope that things will get better without effort, not the false hope that someone else will save us, but the deep hope that comes from knowing that reality is on our side, that consciousness is the direction of evolution, that the forces of awakening are ultimately stronger than the forces of sleep. This hope does not deny the difficulty of the current moment, does not minimize the dangers we face, does not pretend that the outcome is guaranteed. It simply affirms that the struggle is worth engaging, that every moment of genuine perception is a victory, that every crack in the cultural shell lets in light that can never be completely extinguished. The invitation remains open. The door is still there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for you to notice it. The key is attention. Attention withdrawn from the cultural noise and directed toward the reality that the noise conceals. The method is various: meditation, psychedelics, time in nature, artistic creation, contemplative practice, any and all of the technologies that humanity has developed over millennia for piercing the veil. The destination is not elsewhere, but here, not later, but now, not outside the world, but at the very heart of the world, in the place where reality has been hiding in plain sight all along. To notice what is real is to step outside the prison that most people do not know they are in. It is to join the lineage of all those throughout human history who have refused to accept the official story, who have insisted on looking for themselves, who have had the courage to see what they were not supposed to see and to speak what they were not supposed to speak. It is to become what you already are beneath the conditioning, a consciousness capable of direct encounter with existence, a being whose nature is to awaken, a participant in the great mystery that the culture has labored so long to deny. McKenna's voice is silent now. He died in the year 2000, his work incomplete as all work must ultimately be incomplete, his questions unanswered as all ultimate questions must remain unanswered. But his transmission continues, through his books, his recordings, the memories of those who knew him, the ongoing ripples of his influence through the culture he so effectively criticized, and through you, if you choose to receive it, if you choose to add your attention to the attention he paid, if you choose to notice, as he noticed, what is real. The culture will tell you not to. The culture will offer you 1,000 reasons why this is a bad idea, why you should return to the dream, why the comfortable illusions are better than the uncomfortable truth. The culture is very persuasive. It has had millennia to perfect its techniques. It knows your weaknesses, your fears, your desperate need to belong. It will use all of this against you, will try to keep you asleep by any means necessary. But something in you knows. Something in you has always known. Something that was there before the programming began and will be there after the programming ends. This something is your true self, your original face, the awareness that is not produced by culture and cannot be destroyed by culture. It is waiting for you to remember it. It has been waiting since the beginning. And now, perhaps, in this moment, reading these words, something stirs, something notices, something begins to wake up. This is the most dangerous thing you can do. It is also the only thing worth doing.